Clever jokes exist for missing punctuation, ranging from a panda committing felonies in a bar to a family savagely turning cannibalistic towards a family member, all because of a few missing dots and splashes on the page. A quick way to get into an argument with certain types of people is simply to mention putting a third comma in a series. But how did we get here? Where did these rules all come from? Who controls these dots as they dance about the page, and how do they affect our spoken language? Mulvey, in a 2015 article, said, "Punctuation is a communal thing. A use has to be agreed on by a group, but it does not have to be agreed by everyone." Let's take a closer look at where these marks came from, some of the agreements that groups have made, where we might be heading in the future, and if it all matters. When speaking about punctuation, it's important to remember that at its heart, punctuation exists to suggest meaning, not define it. Punctuation and word spacing can only be correctly interpreted when paired together with context and quick wit from the reader. We can all remember the popcorn reading drills in elementary classrooms and the stress and anxiety that came from some students when facing this issue. But now, imagine doing this without any punctuation or word spacing. Not too long ago, this was not only the case, but it was the norm. There are many points that we could start at in history, but we are going to start with the Romans. Around the year 400 CE, if you were to see written Latin, it would look like a solid stream of uninterrupted capitals. Not only was it written with no spaces, lowercase letters, or punctuation, but it also was read using what Houston in the book Shady Characters calls the ox-turning method. This means that you don't simply read left to right and then skip to the next line like we do today, but rather you read the first line left to right, drop to the next line and read it right to left. Then the next line is again read left to right, just like an ox attached to a plow in a field. With no internal markings, it's no wonder why this method was employed to help the reader's eye stay focused. At this time, all texts were meant to be read aloud, with silent reading being the exception and mostly employed to prepare for oral readings. Most of these texts would be incomprehensible to the eye until they were read aloud, according to Scholes and Willis's 1990 journal. But times were changing, and with these changes came more features to the text. Each addition to the written form of the text helped make the transition from oral reading to silent reading, from auditory to visual. I mentioned the year 400 CE before, as this is when the first sighting of word spacing can be seen. It was in this year that Jerome was starting to make the Latin version of the Bible. As the Bible was a religious text, there was a large amount of concern that it would be easily interpreted when read. To help facilitate this, Jerome looked to Roman schoolmasters who had been employing a few tactics to help aid in comprehension: sections and subsections, or as they said, percola et commata, which roughly translates into colons and commas. These marks were put in merely as visual aids for reading aloud. Jerome included elements of these in the Latin version of the Bible, hoping that it would help to maintain the integrity of the content. Around the same time, if you were to walk around Rome, you would notice on the monuments that in between words there was a point, or a punctus. Hibernia brought this same method to the written text, and it wouldn't be long before it was replaced by the modern-day word spacing. Alcuin of York would bring this word space to Europe in the 7th century, and it would quickly be seen in writing all across Europe. With the function of the punctus freed, it could now be used to indicate different things. For example, a punctus over a word would mean a short pause. A punctus floating midline after a word, which formerly meant a word space, indicated a medium pause. A punctus that was made under a word came to be taken as a long pause, or the modern-day period. Paragraphs have a similar origin that is related to a mark that we all know, yet seldom include in our writing today: the pilcrow. Originally, the pilcrow was used to indicate a change in speaker. It was not restricted to the beginning of a line, and served merely as a visual cue to the reader as they read aloud. Sometimes it was also put at the beginning of an argument to indicate a new argument. As writing developed, it is not hard to see how this could easily then transform into a paragraph that holds one main idea. Between the years of 560 to 636 CE, Saint Isidore of Seville would begin to make revolutionary changes to the way we represent written language. For one, he introduced the positura, which looks like a colon with an upward stroke after it, to indicate the end of a section of text. He gave us the punctus interrogativus, also known as the question mark, to indicate questions. Also, he instituted the use of the dipple to indicate a direct quotation from a speaker. This dipple will go on to be duplicated and used to this day by many non-English speaking countries, while English will move to the quotation mark. With the invention of the printing press, writing was again going to need to be reformed. Before, every text was copied by hand, and marks could be made wherever they needed to be. Think back to the punctus. This mark could be put over, next to, or under a word. The printing press with movable type could not effectively recreate these same tasks, so writing needed to be adapted. The first hurdle for the printing press was how to create columns. With movable type, there needed to be a way to position text into columns and still keep the page looking neat and tidy. Gutenberg accomplished this by using something that would come to be one of our modern-day punctuation marks, the hyphen. Texts made on Gutenberg's printing press contain a record number of hyphens, as there would be one in many lines that would serve to help take up space at the end of the line and divide the text into neat columns. William of Caxton would have a different take on the hyphen, however. Putting a punctus above a word was too complicated for the printing press, so he used the virgula, or twig, to indicate a short pause, also known as the modern-day comma. This method of using the virgula for pauses would take over the use of the virgula for about 20 years, until Aldo of Mantua would create the modern-day comma in the 1490s. He added an elegant stroke to the punctus to differentiate it from the period, and thus the modern-day comma was created. Not long after this, Geoffrey Torrey sent the comma to the top of the line, making the modern-day apostrophe, to indicate proper spellings in French. Not to be outdone, this mark was soon used to indicate proper spellings in English, giving us the ability to drop letters out of words and still retain their meaning. While there are many more marks that we could look at, such as Martin K. Spector's provocative interrobang, it is probably best to wrap this section up with a quote from Christopher Mulvey's 2015 article. Serious modern punctuators do not invent punctuation marks. They apply them with rigor and style. They write the guidebooks. We follow them. I have a feeling that he would frown on the modern-day emoticons and emoji that are almost indispensable. With all these marks and rules littering our writing, it begs the question of what has it done to the orality of our language. In his 1988 article, Chafe took on the topic of prosody and punctuation. He said, "We monitor our writing subvocally, reading in an intonation, and the fact that the intonation is not actually shown and our reader is going to have to guess at it is as likely as not to escape our attention." He goes on to show how punctuation is a constant battle to find balance between marking language and thought and marking intonation, as grammar rules are not always prosaically motivated. One well-known example of this is the ongoing debate about the Oxford comma. Yet, even with all the punctuation that is included in written language, fluent oral readers include many more intonation breaks than punctuation dictates. Yet, with the ability to break apart language into sections, authors are able to create longer units of thoughts than speakers, since they are not limited by the memory of their listeners. What's more, written language has more clues than simply punctuation, such as syntactical passages and patterns of speech. In a 1988 study, Chafe found that participants could repunctuate passages with 83% accuracy when the punctuation had been removed, with many of the discrepancies existing due to closed versus open punctuation, or the tension between heard and unheard commas. Finally, in 1990, Scholl and Willis pointed out the difference between the structuralist view and the role of intentional morphology. Structuralists hold that writing is merely a visual representation of speech. However, intentional morphology holds that certain terms and punctuation only hold internal meaning and cannot be understood through the oral reading of a passage. For example, punctuation holds extensional functions in elocution when it shows the speaker when and how to move their voice up, down, and pause. Yet, punctuation also holds intensional functions when it indicates syntactical functions of the text. In their study, they found that 1/3 of people are actually insensitive to the intensional functions of punctuation and merely rely on their pragmatic and strategic expectations, not syntactical evidence, to decipher texts. They suggest, based on these findings, that perhaps the term of literate needs to be further defined to include orthographically literate and writing literate. Punctuation has a long history, and it's not over. Coding, emoticons, emoji, GIFs, and texting have all brought new life and definitions to the world of punctuation and writing. Long gone are the days of, they write the guidebooks, we follow them. Now, we're in the realm of this. And this. And even this. Who knows where we will be in the future?